Now that I have completed the color map, I'll be importing the heightfield and color map into Unreal. In this video, I'll be creating the Unreal project, importing the provided Unreal project files, importing the heightfield, and begin setting up the landscape material. So in this video, we're going to begin exporting our landscape and importing it into Unreal Engine. So I'm going to drop down a rock geometry output, and I'm going to call this landscape heightfield.bgeo. And a .bgeo file is a Houdini specific file type. This will contain our maintain our heightfield and all of the information we've stored on it. So let's now hit save to disk to save that out. And I've saved that into $hip.geo. So that's going to be beside my Houdini file. So if I just take a look at my project files, here is my hip file that I'm working in. And if I go into geo, and here are the landscape heightfield.bgeo file I've just exported. So next I'm going to create an Unreal project. So I'm going to launch the Epic Games launcher, and I'm on Unreal Engine. Let's go over to Library, and I'm working in Unreal 5.3.2. So I'm going to launch it. And we're going to create a new project. I'm going to choose the third person template. Let's just come back up to my drive here, and that's where I want to save my project. Let's call this Pegasus landscape. Okay, now that's been created, I'm just going to minimize this and come back to my project folder. So here's the Unreal project that's just been created. I come into my project files, and into project files, we have here some Unreal project files. So I'm going to copy this content folder, come into my Unreal project. I'm in the root here, you can see I've got a content folder here, so I'm going to paste those files into here. And if we come inside, that's pasted in this Pegasus folder. So we've got a few different things here which we're going to be using. One thing we're going to be using is a digital asset here which I created called HDA file load. And all this is a digital asset that I've wrapped up, and inside is just a file node. And I've just exposed the geometry file input so I can select a file and load it into Unreal. So that's all that HDA has inside it, is just a file node. Actually, before I do that, I need to install the Houdini engine plugin for Unreal. So let's close this Unreal project. And I already have the plugin downloaded, but I'll show you how to get it. If you have the Houdini launcher installed, come over to Engine Plugins. And you see here I've already got the Unreal plugin for the version of Houdini that I'm using here. So I'm using Houdini 20.0.653, and I have the plugin for that particular version. And you can install plugins straight from this install button. This is the current production build, or you can choose another version and choose a previous production build that might match your version of Houdini. You may need to upgrade your version of Houdini if you can't find a version for your Unreal plugin. But it is important that these versions match. If they don't match, then you might have some issues launching the Unreal Houdini engine plugin. And once you've installed the plugin, you want to find where it's installed, or go to that directory. And an easy way to find it, if you click on the little cog here, go to details, you can see the install directory for the Houdini engine plugins. So I'm going to copy or highlight and copy that path and navigate to it. And let's come into 5.3, and here we have this Houdini engine folder. So I want to copy this into my Unreal project. I'm going to I'm going to create a folder in the root of my Unreal project called plugins, and then copy this Houdini engine folder into that plugins folder that I've just created. Now that's done, I'm going to relaunch my Pegasus landscape project, and you can now see I've got this Houdini engine menu. If you come now into the Pegasus folder, into levels, as you'll see here, I've got this Pegasus level that I've created for this project. If you don't see this, it could very well be that you haven't got the Houdini engine plugin installed correctly, because if it detects that it's using a plugin that you haven't got installed, it won't show the level. So if we open this level, in here, all I've got is an empty scene, a direct light, sky atmosphere, and a skylight. These all have the default settings. All I've done really is just imported these and positioned the directional light. Now I'm going to go over to the HDA folder, and we have our HDA file load. I'm going to right click on it and click instantiate at the origin, and this will place the digital asset in the scene at origin, so it's positioned in the center of our world. There we go, and Houdini engine has just started. So it may take a second after you've added the HDA for the Houdini engine session to begin. You can also come up to the Houdini engine menu and click create session if a session hasn't already started for you. If for any reason you have issues launching Houdini engine, you can come to this installation info option, and this will give you some information about the Houdini version they're using, the version of the Houdini engine. Also, it'll let you know whether or not you've acquired a license. So this might just help troubleshoot if you do have any particular issues. So now that I've added this digital asset to my scene, I'm going to scroll down to Houdini parameters, and here you can see that geometry file parameter which I said I had exposed. So I'm going to click the three little buttons and navigate over to my Pegasus landscape color map folder, into project files, geo, and here that landscape heightfield BGO file which I exported from Houdini. If I double click it, Houdini engine will now start loading that file and importing the landscape into our scene. And here is our landscape. Some useful controls to know in Unreal. So I'm using right click to look around, and then using the WASD buttons on my keyboard to zoom around. And whilst I'm holding right click, if I scroll in the mouse wheel I can speed up, and if I scroll down on the mouse wheel I can slow down whilst holding right click. So that can be useful to help speed up navigation around a large landscape. Next, let's begin by making the material for our landscape. So I'm going to come into the materials folder, right click, and click material. Let's call this M material underscore landscape. And then I'm going to right click on my material I've just created and create a material instance. Call this one MI, material instance, then underscore landscape. And let's just come up to the file menu and hit save all. So that's going to save our level as well as the two materials we just created. Okay, so now if I select the landscape in the outliner, I can just drag and drop this material onto landscape to apply it. But if I was to then recook the digital asset to reload the landscape, this landscape gets deleted and a new one gets loaded in and we'll lose the material. So instead, I want to create an attribute on my height field that references this material. If you search for the Houdini engine Unreal documentation and come to attributes and groups, you can see here a list of special attributes that can be placed on objects in a HDA that Houdini engine will recognize. You can see here one of those is Unreal Material. And this is a Unreal path of material asset to apply to an output. You can also see what type of attribute this needs to be. It doesn't need to be on primitives. It is a detail attribute. It also has a type here, so whether it needs to be a string, an integer, or a float. So we can see here that this particular one needs to be a string. So let's come back over to Houdini, and before my geometry output node, I'm going to add a node called attribute create. And we know the name needs to be Unreal Material. And I'm going to put this on primitives. And the type needs to be string. Now we have a field here where we can place a reference to our material. So let's come back to Unreal. I'm going to come to the material instance, right click on it, and come to copy reference. Come back to Houdini, right click in the string field and hit paste values. And here is a reference to the landscape material instance. We can also look at the geometry spreadsheet, look at the primitives, and we can see here it has that string primitive. Something else I like to do as well is just remove any unnecessary layers when I'm exporting a height field. That just reduces the file size and kind of discards any unnecessary information that might cause an issue. So we can see I'm not using in Unreal the mask or the color RGB channels, so let's delete those. And we can do that using a blast. So before my attribute create, I'm going to add down a blast, and from the group, let's select R, G, and B for the 3 color channels, and then also mask. So now when I middle mouse click, I just see the layers that I'm using in Unreal. All of my different layers for my Unreal material, and then the height. So that just helps tidy things up. So let's select the ROP geometry output and hit save to disk. So that's saved our height field with this attribute on it. Let's come back to Unreal and select our HDA file load and click recook. And then now if I select my landscape, we can see we have that material instance applied. Open the landscape material. So now we want to start adding some color to each one of our layers for the landscape. So I'm going to right click and search for landscape layer blend. And here, if we can look under the array, I can add layers to this layer blend. And I want to have 6 layers. Index, the first layer starts with an index of 0, so that's 0 to 6. And now I want to add some names. Just going to dock Unreal over here, and then put Houdini to the left, to the right. And the attribute create, hover over, and then click the eye icon to view the information. And then I'm going to click this little pin icon here in the top left, and that just pins this window open, so if I click off, it doesn't disappear. So I can see each one of the layers, and now I need to name each of these layers on my layer blend to match the corresponding layer. And I want to match this order as well. I want to go from base, lowlands, sands, right down to riverbed in the same order on the layer blend. So I'm just going to expand my first index and call this one base. And then the next one is lowlands. Then we have sand, cliffs, rocks, debris, finally riverbed. Okay, so now we have all these named. Let's focus back on Unreal. Let's just connect that to the base color, and let's start adding some colors. So I'm going to hold 3 on my keyboard and left click in the material graph, and that will add down this vector color. And let's just start by choosing a green and add that to the base layer. Just going to copy and paste that and make this a slightly darker green. Maybe change the color slightly, change the hue. Okay, attach that to lowlands, and again copy this. So now we have sand. So let's just add this as kind of very pale yellow. Okay, next is cliffs. I'm just going to make this one grey. Attach that to cliffs. Then we have rocks. So I'm just going to make this one a darker grey. And these are just temporary, just whilst we want to preview these layers. So don't be too precious about these. We will just delete them again in a moment. And now we've got debris. So let's make this a dark brown. And then finally, riverbed. Let's make this a slightly lighter brown. Okay, and attach these last two. So we've got debris and riverbed. So these are all now connected. I'm going to hit save. And then come back to my digital asset and hit recook. And there we have our landscape with our colours visible. So we can see we have a different colour for our highlands and lowlands. We have our cliffs with the rock colour at the bottom, and then the riverbed with the debris, which flows out to the ocean where we have our sand. So we can see our landscape layers are working. I'm going to come over to selection mode and switch to landscape. And we can see here we now have those different layers. So when we ran this digital asset, it imported our heightfield. Houdini engine recognized that there was a layer blend with different layers on the layer blend, which corresponded to layers on the heightfield. So it created these layers and added in the landscape layer for each of our layers. So the next thing to do would be to add some textures to replace these solid colors. And for the textures, I'm going to be using something called a 2D texture array. So I'm going to come to my textures folder here, right click, and then under texture, select texture 2D array. I'm going to call this TA for texture array underscore landscape underscore D for diffuse. And let's open this texture array. And so with a texture array, what we can actually do is under the source 2D here, we see it says source textures. And here I can specify several different textures to add to this array. And this means I can create a texture for each one of my different layers on my landscape. So let's grab some textures for the landscape. Let's go into Window and then Quicksort Bridge. And if you have an Epic account, then you can download any of these textures for free, as long as you're using them with an Unreal project. And we can just search for something like grass. Find a grass texture that we like. And hit download. And just wait for that to download. And once it's downloaded, you can hit add. And that will import it into our Unreal project. So if I bring this out of the way, you can see here, it's out of this Megascans folder, and in it we have this mossy grass texture. So now you just need to spend a few minutes just downloading some textures to use with our landscape. I've already downloaded some textures, so I'm just going to import these now into Unreal. I just kind of pick these rather quickly, so you might want to take a bit more time just choosing some nice textures that complement one another. So let's just import these now. Okay, those are now imported. If you want to use the exact same ones that I have, you can see the little code here. You could search for this code and that will get you to the exact same texture that I'm using. So I'm just going back to my texture array and add some source textures. And we want 7 array elements, 0 to 6. And just to begin adding in those textures. And we want to do them in the exact same order that we have here on our layer blend. So from base to riverbed. So first of all, we want the base, which will be one of these moss textures. So let's add that to index 0. And then this other grass here to the second one. Actually, let's find a different grass texture. Those look a bit too similar. Let's add this grass here. Mossy forest floor. There we go, so they're slightly more distinct. Okay, then we had the sand. Let's add in the sand base color. Then we had cliffs. So I have this granite rock. Then we had rocks. And I'm using this gravel texture. Then we had debris. We have this desert outback texture. And then finally riverbeds, which I'm using this dry cracked mud. Okay, so now we have all of these different layers. These look dark, and that's because I need to come down and check sRGB. And we also want to set some bitmap settings. I guess let's do sharpen 7. So let's hit save on that and come back into our material. We can now delete these colors and add in this texture, 2D texture array. So before we hook this up, we need to add an input to these UVs here. So I'm going to add in a world position. And usually texture samples, they take a 2D vector, so a U and a V coordinate. But for 2D texture arrays, they take the UV coordinates plus a third value, which represents the index for the texture array. So an index of 0 for the first, 1 for the second, 2 for the third, and so on. So let's now add an append vector, and then I'm going to hold 1 on the keyboard and left click to add this constant value. I'm going to right click, convert to parameter, and name this index. Select X and Y to A, and then index to B, and connect that to the UVs. And then connect this RGB to layer base, and that's connected to base color. Let's hit save and take a look at our landscape. So we can see the green of the texture, but if you zoom in, you can actually see this looks like it's a solid color. But that's because our texture is very, 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 very small. So I'm going to make this bigger by adding a multiply and then multiplying this by a value of 0.01 and attach that to the append. Let's save and take another look. Let's just dock these up here out of the way so I can switch back and forth. And zoom in, and now we can see those tiling textures. And so multiplying that by a value of 0.01, this now, a single texture here, is 1 meter in size. And we're not going to worry too much about the tiling. We can see at the moment, we just want to make sure we can see the textures, which we can. Now if I come back to my landscape material, I'm going to update this index, change it to a value of 1, and hit save. We can see that's now changed that texture to the second texture in the 2D array. If I set this to 2, now we have that sand texture, and so on. So let's just make some more room here. So now I'm going to copy and paste this texture sample. So you just want to copy these into, you have 7 of these, 1 for each layer, and attach each one of these to the different layers. And we have a couple of options here. I could duplicate this append here. So let's duplicate this one for each one of these. So you have an append for each layer. And connect up our absolute world position. And then one option would be, so we start with an index of 0, then add another constant value here. So you've got 1, then 2, and so on. You could do it that way. Another option is to take this index and then add a value of 1 to it, and then keep adding on a value of 1. So we're just incrementing from 0 to 1, then to 2, and then to 3, and so on. And the reason I'm doing it this way is this will become a little bit more relevant later when I show you a material function that I made to make this setup a little bit neater. Okay, so starting at 0, we're adding on 1 each time. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then finally index 6. So now if I hit save and take a look at landscape, we see all of those textures across our landscape. Switch to unlit mode so we can see that a bit more clearly. So here we can see those tiling textures. Now, it might start to become obvious that if we now want to create some texture samples for normal and then create another set for roughness, this is going to get quite busy quite quickly. So that's why I created this material function, which I'm about to show you. So if we come back into our content browser, into materials, and into functions, we have several different functions here. One of them is called MF texture array. So I can grab this MF texture array, drag it up to my material here, and drop it inside. And if I jump inside here, we can see here I have some 2D texture arrays. And over here, I have an absolute world position, a multiply, multiplying it by 0.01, just like I was doing in my material. I've also created a parameter here, and I've called it tiling macro, and it has a value of 8. So this will now set our tiling so one texture is tiled across over 8 meters. And here I have an input for the first index. See here I'm starting at a value of -1, and then I'm adding 1 to that value. And then that's going here to an output. And that output is here on this index array. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace what I'm doing here, where I'm adding 1 each time, and my texture sample with this material function. So let's just delete all of these and plug in my material function. So I need to duplicate these just as I did before with the texture samples. And one more. If you'd like to keep your graph nice and tidy, you can select all of these, right click on them, and then come to alignment, and then you can distribute these vertically to have them more neatly spaced, and then right click and also align right. Now that's line them up all nice and neat. Okay, so when this material function has no input, it's going to start with the default value, which is -1. This add is then increasing it to a value of 0, and then that is being appended and put into the UV input on my texture sample for my 2D array. That value is also being outputted from the material function. So if I now take this array index and plug it into the input on my next material function, this material function will increase that from a value of 0 to a value of 1, and then input it into the texture array. So this is pretty much doing the exact same functionality I had before, but I've just encapsulated it inside a material function. So if I just take these and plug these into one another, and then come inside my material function, you can just double click it to open it up. Let's disconnect these three for now, because I've not got a normal occlusion, roughness, or displacement. So let's add in our texture array. And I'm using this to set material attributes. So if I come and hit save, to come back material, and just make sure you're not selecting any nodes, and let's switch this to use material attributes. So now rather than outputting this to base color, I'm actually assembling the different attributes for the material, base color, normal, etc. here inside this function. So now let's just save our material function and save our material and take a look at our landscape. And we can see those tiny textures on our landscape. Now, all that functionality I had previously demonstrated, I've just encapsulated inside this material function. So I can have my 2D texture array for base color, normal, and occlusion and roughness, just all contained in one material function. That just helps keep this slightly neater. So if we come back to our contents browser and down to texture, I want to now create a 2D texture array for the normal and the occlusion and roughness maps. So let's just duplicate this texture array. So I'm just going to select it and hit Control D on the keyboard. This one is going to be called n_n for normal, and duplicate one more time. And I'm going to call this one ORDP for occlusion, roughness, and displacement. And that's because those are the textures that get channel packed in the Quixel Megascan textures. So now let's do normal first. So double click the normal 2D array. What I'm going to do is just go through, and we've got the first color map. I'm going to hit this little browse to icon, this little folder with a magnifying glass. That's going to take me directly to where that diffuse texture. I can just grab the corresponding normal map and replace that base color texture. And I can just repeat that for each one of my textures. So just browsing to where the texture is, and then swapping it out for the corresponding normal map. There we go. And then once that's done, we want to come to compression settings and set it to normal map. And make sure sRGB is unchecked. So we can hit save on that. So let's come back to textures and now open up the occlusion, roughness and displacement. And we want to do the exact same process. So let's just hit this magnifying glass, find our texture, and drag and drop in the occlusion, roughness and displacement map. There we go. So that's one of those textures applied. And for this one, I just want to make sure sRGB is also unchecked. Let's hit save. Come back to our material function for our texture array. And let's now just search for TA underscore. And we have the normal map. And then occlusion, roughness and displacement. TA underscore. And then there we are, ORDP. So now let's connect back up this normal map here. Let's just zoom in. And ORDP is in the order in which they're packed in different channels. So we have occlusion in R, in red, roughness in G, and then displacement in the blue channel. So now if we hit save, just wait that to update this shader. And I switch back to lit and zoom in. And hopefully we can tell we've got a normal map on our landscape. So there we go. Now our textures, well, material, sorry, has some roughness and normal map information. So now that we have our texture 2D texture array set up with all our different textures for our different layers, let's do something about this very obvious tiling. And what I want to do is have two different versions of the textures, one that's tiled much larger, so I can, so from a distance, the tiling isn't quite so obvious, and then when I zoom in, a version that's tiled a lot more frequently, just for up close. So from a distance, I won't see this tiling. And we can use a material function that I have in here called cheap camera fade. Let me just demonstrate what this does first. So I'm just going to drag and drop that into my material. And let's do make material attributes and just plug that in. So I've just plugged this material function into my base color and then plug that into my material attributes output. We're going to want to give this a fade. So let's add a constant here and then add in a value of 5,000 and then a value of 1,000. So I'm putting a value of 5,000 into the fade and then a value of 1,000 into the start. Let's save this material and just take a look at our landscape and see what this does. So you can see currently it's all white, but as I zoom in, it starts to fade to black. So what I can do is use this as an alpha. So around the player, more frequently tiled version of the textures, and then further away, we can have it tiled less frequently. So hopefully the tiling won't be so obvious. And when we zoom out, we'll fade between the two. So if I just bring this over here and change some of these values. In fact, let's right click. I'm going to convert this to a parameter and call this fade distance. And then on the second one, convert to parameter, I'm going to call this one fade start. So one is, where do you want this fade to start? And then how far, or what is the distance that I want this to fade across? If I save this, and now take a look at my material instance, and find those values. And so here we have the fade start, and as I increase that value, the fade gets further away. And then the fade distance starts to increase that fade distance, so we can see it's a much larger gradient. So if I increase this, see that circle get bigger, and then that fade distance getting much, much longer. So it's a much larger fade. Values of 5,000 and 1,000 worked well for me. So I'm going to leave it at that. And what I'm going to do is delete this make material attributes and re-plug in our landscape blend. So I'm going to copy the fade distance and fade start and my material function for the camera fade. I'm going to do Control X to cut those and paste them into the material function for the texture array. So let's open that up. And I'm going to paste it into here. And so now what I'm going to do is copy these 3 texture arrays, put another copy up here, and also copy the tiling parameter and the divide. Let's call this tiling and plug my multiply into the divide. And then also copy this append and paste a version up here. And I'm actually going to swap this around. I'm going to take my divide for my tiling macro, plug that into my new append, and this one that I've just copied and pasted, I'm going to pop that into my original append. So let's plug these into the UVs. And then I just need to grab the add from the array index input and pop that into the B input for my append. And let's increase the tiling macro here to 16. Okay, so now I need to blend between these 2 sets of textures. I'm going to do that using this material function. So let's give us a bit more room here. Holding L on my keyboard, I'm going to click 3 times, and that'll drop down these 3 lerps. And these can be used to blend between 2 different inputs based on an alpha. So the alpha will be our cheap fade, this material function. So let's plug that into the alpha for all 3. And then for these top 2, which are my tiling macro textures, I'm going to plug the RGB into the first input of the lerps. So first of all, base color, normal, and then occlusion, roughness, and displacement. And then with the second input, it'll be these 2D texture arrays for the smaller tiling. So again, RGB from the base color, RGB from the normal, and then RGB from occlusion, roughness, and displacement. And now if I take my split components and my set material attributes and bring them up here, we can just swap these across to these 3 lerps. Let's just disconnect these by holding Alt and left clicking on these inputs, and then reconnect these lerps. So we have the base color, then we have the normal, and then for the occlusion, roughness, and displacement, I'm going to pop it into this split component. and I'll split out the ambient occlusion, roughness and displacement channels. Okay, so with that done, let's hit save. Now we have our tiling textures, but it looks like I actually have the tiling the wrong way around. So I have it tiled much larger tiles close to the camera and further away it's tiling more. So actually what I'm going to do is come to my cheap fade and add down a 1 minus. And then if you hold control and left click on an input, you can drag all of the wires and plug them into a different node. And then let's just input my cheap fade into this 1 minus. This will invert the mask. And now let's take a look at that. Okay, so now when I zoom in, so close to the camera, we have much smaller tiles, and then further away, the tiles are much larger, so I don't see the repetition quite so much. So that's a really good start. Now the player probably isn't going to be able to see the landscape from this far back, so the tiling from this distance probably isn't too much of a worry, but we can still do a lot more to help break up and add more visual interest to this landscape, and that's where our colour map comes in, because we can take our colour map that we created and overlay it over these tiling textures to add a bit more breakup and some more visual variety. So that's what we're going to do next.